Every day at 3 a.m. in a dark bedroom in Tokyo, long after the apartment has fallen silent, a 34-year-old man cracks open his door for the first time all day. He pauses, listening for footsteps. In the off chance anyone is awake, he doesn't want to risk being seen. After slipping quietly into the kitchen, he takes the plate of fish and rice that his mother left for him wrapped in plastic and hurries back to his room, locks the door and returns to his computer, back safe and sound. This has been his life for 6 years. Tomorrow is going to be the same, and the day after that, the same still. He is one of Japan's million-plus Hikikomori, people who have withdrawn so completely from society that leaving the room feels impossible. But what should disturb us even more is that investigators are discovering the same patterns emerging across the developed world, from South Korea to Italy to the United States. In 1998, a Japanese psychiatrist named Tamaki Saito began to document something that most of his colleagues dismissed as isolated cases of teenage rebellion. Yet what he discovered would reveal a crisis so profound, so deeply woven into the fabric of Japanese society, that even today the government struggles to comprehend its true scale. In his groundbreaking book, Adolescence Without End, Saito gave a name to what he was witnessing: Hikikomori, a phenomenon where young people, often teenagers or those in their early 20s, would retreat into their bedrooms and refuse all contact with the outside world, not for days, not for weeks, but for years, decades even. We begin today's investigation into this phenomenon with what seems like a pretty simple observation. Saito had noticed that certain patients weren't just experiencing depression or anxiety, they were just completely withdrawing from the whole of society, barricading themselves in rooms within their parents' homes and emerging only when absolutely certain that they weren't going to bump into another human. Now, at first, the medical establishment assumed that these were kind of just anomalies, perhaps a few hundred cases scattered across Japan. That was it. But the reality was a whole lot more disturbing. What Saito had uncovered wasn't just a handful of troubled youths. It was the earliest visible symptoms of a social phenomenon that would take nearly 2 decades to even acknowledge. Throughout the 2000s, the evidence accumulated in ways that just became impossible to dismiss, and the anecdotal cases multiplied into clusters of withdrawn individuals. As realization did begin to grow about the true extent of this problem, the government decided to launch the first official survey back in 2016, and they were expecting to see hundreds, maybe a few thousand. Instead, what they discovered was something that nobody saw coming. Approximately 541,000 Hikikomori. This number alone should have triggered immediate alarm, especially given who it didn't count. The survey critically only examined those aged 50 to 39, an oversight that almost certainly meant significantly more was still being completely unaccounted for. Indeed, this survey proved merely to be the tip of the iceberg. A follow-up, expanded survey in 2019 uncovered an additional 613,000 cases among those aged 40 to 64. Japan was forced to confront an almost incomprehensible truth that approximately 1.5 million people were living as complete recluses. And then came 2020. The pandemic forced everyone into isolation, and for the first time the entire world experienced what Hikikomori had been living for decades, at least to some extent. But when the lockdowns lifted and society reopened, something rather disturbing happened. Countless Japanese, they just didn't emerge. They'd tasted the strange comfort of withdrawal, and returning to the world just felt impossible for them. The mass withdrawal has roots that run deeper than economic pressure or social anxiety, though, and it's closely tied into the country's employment system, which is so rigid that a single misstep at age 22 can destroy your professional aspirations for the rest of your life. Japan's corporate world operates on a principle of simultaneously hiring all new recruits at once a year after graduations. This process is ritualistic. Students begin job hunting in their 3rd year of university, attend massive recruitment fairs, and compete for positions at major corporations that promise lifetime employment. Get hired by Mitsubishi or Toyota and you are set for life. But if you miss that window, you'll likely spend the rest of your life marked as something called an irregular worker. The pressure begins long before employment time, though, making the eventual hiring phase all the more stressful. From middle school onward, Japanese students carry the weight of knowing that their entire economic future hinges on performing perfectly at one specific moment years in the future. This only compounds through the years as the inevitable date draws closer and as they watch some of their peers stumble and fall. This system alone is absolutely soul-crushing, but it is made even worse by a concept in Japanese culture called sekentai, which roughly translates to something like reputation. But that translation doesn't really capture the importance that this carries. You see, when you fail in Japan, you're not just disappointing yourself, you're destroying what your parents built, you're shaming your siblings' future prospects, and you're dishonoring ancestors that you've never even met. That's why one rejected job application can feel so awful. And once you've failed like that, the shame becomes so unbearable that hiding in your room starts to feel like the only honorable option left. I mean, at least there, you're not making things worse and you're away from others' prying eyes. When young people first started retreating during Japan's economic collapse in the 1990s, families just assumed that this was temporary. It was a phase, a rough patch, something that was just going to eventually pass. Nobody imagined that 3 decades later, those 20-somethings would still be there, now in their 50s, still hidden away in their bedrooms. This dynamic has created what Japan now calls the 80-50 crisis, a reference to the 80-year-old parents still living with and often supporting their 50-year-old children who have been withdrawn since their youth. Reports have revealed that in Tokyo's Idagawa ward alone, 1/3 of nearly 8,000 identified Hikikomori were in their 40s and 50s, still living with their elderly parents who have been caring for them their entire lives. While Hikikomori are both men and women, the phenomenon skews heavily male. While exact data varies, it's estimated that between 60 and 80% are men. This disparity doesn't reflect women facing less pressures while growing up. They're equally parts of the system in Japan. It does, however, reflect the reality that Japanese society's expectations on gender create different escape routes if the initial job hunt is unsuccessful for women that simply are not as socially acceptable for men. For the dudes, the cultural component remains heavily skewed, and expecting them to become a salaried provider who works continuously from graduation to retirement. Failure to achieve this one acceptable path means guaranteed shunning. There is no culturally sanctioned alternative path. Now, women face their own crushing expectations, but Japanese society has historically offered them what might cynically be called acceptable forms of invisibility. A woman who fails to secure corporate employment can retreat into domestic roles, becoming a housewife, caring for aging parents that, while limiting and often isolating in their own ways, don't carry the same totalizing shame that drives someone to barricade themselves in a bedroom. But for those who do withdraw completely, and there are many of both genders, the years turn into decades, creating a ticking time bomb as their caregivers age. As the parents continue to age, it leaves their children in increasingly vulnerable situations. They've never taken care of themselves their entire lives. In one Japanese television interview, an 82-year-old mother caring for her 52-year-old son broke down in tears, wondering aloud that very question. I mean, when she dies, how is her son going to take care of himself after not having left the house in over 20 years? She doesn't even know if he remembers how to shop for food. And her fears were not unfounded. That same year, in Sapporo, authorities discovered what happens when these hypothetical questions become reality. The bodies of an 82-year-old mother and her 52-year-old Hikikomori daughter, both of whom were dead from starvation. The mother had collapsed first, and her daughter was either unwilling or unable to seek help or even venture outside for food. Neighbors hadn't seen them for a week. But that wasn't exactly unusual, especially for the daughter. By the time anyone did check, both had been dead for over a month. The able-bodied daughter literally starved to death rather than face the outside world. Despite this case, the problem only seemed to continue to be getting worse, and the government recognized that something had to be done. The crisis had evolved from a family matter into a national emergency, but the statistics, they only tell a part of the story here. The numbers, 1.5 million withdrawn, the 80-50 crisis, 20% triggered by COVID, these tell us the scale of Japan's emergency, but they don't reveal what happens when a human being disappears into their room for years, undergoing a transformation so profound that those who experience it often struggle to recognize who they once were. To understand the metamorphosis, we need to examine what occurs behind those closed doors. The triggering event is rarely dramatic when viewed from the outside. A failed exam, a rejection at work, or simply the accumulated weight of stress over the years. Whatever it may be, the person experiences it as unbearable confirmation that they cannot succeed in the world as it exists. The subsequent retreat into their room that follows feels like a relief, a blessed absence of judgment, expectation, and disappointment. They tell themselves it's just temporary, just until this passes, just until they figure things out. They desperately want to have a purpose, to matter, but in seeking temporary shelter from pain, they make the catastrophic mistake of choosing withdrawal over perseverance, convincing themselves this is their only option when in reality it becomes the very thing that destroys them. But something else happens in their room too. They know each time that they leave, they're re-entering that very world from which escape felt so good. The more they find themselves spending more time there, the more they want to stay. For those without other obligations, especially those who didn't secure a career during their narrow window of opportunity, who have nothing but time, days begin to blur together, losing their distinct edges. Under such intense isolation, in such a confined space, the human brain really does begin to lose the ability to perceive time. One documentary tellingly showed a man who couldn't say whether specific events happened last year or 5 years ago. As Kim Jae-ju, who withdrew in his late 20s, described it, one day became 2 days, then a year. I started thinking, maybe this lifestyle is okay. The walls of the room became the boundaries of existence, and the physical degradation that accompanies extreme withdrawal becomes visible. Days and nights lose meaning, and many flip their schedules entirely. The outside world, with its rigid schedules and expectations, starts to feel increasingly alien, and the four walls of the room become the only reality that makes sense. The living conditions inside the room, of course, vary widely depending on the individual, and we don't want to paint with too broad of a brush here, but as you might imagine, locking yourself in one small room for such extreme periods of time doesn't typically result in the cleanest reputation. The sight of disposable ramen cups and various empty bottles which turn into mini mountains of trash are common. Some reach the stage where leaving the room can be such a stressful moment that they urinate in bottles rather than risk encountering family members in the hallway on the way to the toilet. Yeah, it can really be that bad. Yet paradoxically, while their physical existence deteriorates, many hikikomori maintain comparatively vibrant online lives. And this is where our modern tragedy becomes clear. They're seeking exactly what humans always have sought: connection and meaning. They couldn't find it in the real world, and after missing their moment, they feel as though they won't ever be able to find it again, so they give up and they look elsewhere. Contrary to what you may think, they can be social, well, at least by the standards of this episode. They build relationships through screens, which can help provide just enough dopamine and pseudo-social interaction to maintain some sense of normalcy. For them, this digital existence has become more real than reality itself. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of this phenomenon is how family dynamics, rooted in love as well as a large dose of cultural shame, actually enable the withdrawal. Japanese society places enormous stigma on career failures and family problems, leading parents to hide their children's condition for years, sometimes decades. The families become prisoners to an extent too, maintaining a facade of normalcy while knowing the situation is anything but. There's a critical threshold that experts have identified, at which point something fundamental shifts. Before the 3-year mark, recovery remains relatively achievable. After it, though, the psychological patterns become so entrenched that withdrawal transforms from a temporary escape into something that much closer resembles a permanent identity. The fear of the outside world calcifies into something impenetrable. The truly insidious nature of this condition is how it corrupts even the desire for change. Many hikikomori report existing in a state of suspended animation, neither fully engaged with life nor seeking escape from it. The apathy becomes so complete that even imagining change feels exhausting. They recognize their situation is unsustainable, yet remain psychologically paralyzed, unable to take even the smallest step towards recovery. The enabling structure of modern technology and family support creates a perfect trap. As one recovered hikikomori explained, "My new friends just became the computer inside my room. Digital worlds provide just enough stimulation to prevent complete psychological collapse while ensuring they never address their actual condition. Parental care removes the survival pressures that might force change. This combination sustains them in a twilight existence, physically present but psychologically absent, aware their lives are slipping away, yet finding the thought of re-engagement unbearable. In a society where purpose feels increasingly elusive, their withdrawal becomes a warning of what happens when people stop believing they have a place in the world." Now, for the last decade or so, Japan's hikikomori phenomenon caught the world's attention as some sort of strange byproduct of the worst overreaches by their culture's rigidity. Western observers often dismissed it as something that literally could not spread, a product of Japan's specific mix of factors. And for what it's worth, there are a lot of uniquely Japanese components to the hikikomori situation that make a perfect one-to-one duplication overseas just impossible. Yet what we're discovering is that hikikomori-style withdrawal emerges predictably in societies happens when specific conditions align: sufficient wealth to survive without working, technology that simulates human connection, and competitive systems where failure carries devastating shame. While we may never see the exact Hikikomori phenomenon replicated elsewhere, we are nevertheless witnessing patterns of extreme social isolation that share enough DNA with the Hikikomori to demand attention. Italy was among the first Western nations to recognize what was happening. Back in 2019, psychologist Marco Crepaldi published research suggesting that at least 100,000 Italian adolescents and young adults were living in complete social withdrawal. What struck Crepaldi most of all was the familiar patterns running throughout the cases. Italian parents were describing their children who slept all day and emerged only at night. The testimonies could have been translated directly from Japanese. Cases of those completely closing themselves off with few interests and even less motivation. Crepaldi took a more radical approach by calling these cases Hikikomori, despite not being Japanese. He recognized this as systematic withdrawal from social existence enabled by Italy's strong family structure, where adult children commonly live with their parents well into their late 20s and even early 30s, creating dynamics that eerily echoed those in Japan, at least to an extent. The Italian cultural phenomenon of bambisioni, literally big babies living off their parents, was definitely nothing new, but it really had escalated considerably over the last few years. Testimony of Aldo, a 21-year-old Italian, reveals how universal certain aspects of the withdrawal have become. Quoting him, "Today apathy is what governs my days. There is nothing that excites me or pushes me to do something. I often stay in bed and only get up to eat or go to the bathroom. Even if I know I'm wrong, I cannot do anything else, nor do I want to. I feel good like this, despite everything." Now, the paralysis that he describes there, the comfortable numbness of isolation, it transcends any previously diagnosed condition. And that final phrase, "I feel good like this," reveals the trap's most insidious aspect. The withdrawal provides just enough comfort, just enough absence of stress to feel preferable to the terror of attempting reintegration. This is a distinctly modern phenomenon. To head back to a country both geographically and culturally closer to Japan, we can take a look at South Korea. There, the Ministry of Health's 2023 estimate of 540,000 young Koreans living in extreme social withdrawal represents 5% of the entire 19 to 39 age group. This means that in certain age brackets, 1 in 20 young Koreans has essentially dropped out of society, a rate that rivals Japan's own crisis and suggests this isn't merely cultural mimicry, but a response to similar pressures: intense academic competition, narrow employment windows, and the shame of failing to meet societal expectations. Kim Jae-ju, who withdrew in his late 20s after a relationship breakdown and career stagnation, described how the slide into isolation felt almost natural. One day became 2 days, then a year. I started thinking, maybe this lifestyle is okay, and my new friends just became the computer inside my room. Japanese broadcasters have captured the extremes of familial disconnection in Hikikomori households. In one documented case, a mother hadn't actually seen her withdrawn son in years. He moved only at night, avoiding all contact to whatever extent possible. And there's a sobering economic reality that helps explain why this crisis appears only in certain societies. Hikikomori don't exist in starving countries. As researchers have bluntly but accurately noted in such areas, quote, "If you don't work, you don't eat." This phenomenon requires a baseline of material security, whether through family support or welfare systems that remove the immediate survival pressure that has defined human existence for most of human history. The American data reveals something related but different: a mass exit from work that, while not approaching the extreme isolation of Hikikomori, suggests troubling parallels. Economist Nicholas Eberstadt's research uncovered what he calls a social science straight line. Between 1965 and 2019, America's population of prime-age men neither working nor looking for work grew by approximately 10,000 each month. By late 2019, before the pandemic, keep in mind, roughly 7 million prime-age men were neither working or looking for work. These men aren't nearly as isolated as their Japanese counterparts. Many leave their homes and have some sort of social tie. Yet, what Eberstadt documents is a withdrawal from productive participation that echoes, in a diluted form, the same social abandonment found in the East. This represents more than 1 in 10 adult American men who have simply vanished from the workforce. The labor force participation rate for men in this age bracket has collapsed from 98% in 1954 to 89% by 2024, essentially returning returning to Great Depression levels of work absence, just without the impact on official employment numbers given that they're not looking for work. As Eberstadt observes, American male work rates in 2015 were actually slightly lower than in 1940 during the tail end of the Great Depression, despite living in what he calls the wealthiest and most productive society ever known. This paradox that the richest societies produce the most withdrawal points to something beyond simple economics. What unites these disparate populations from Tokyo to Detroit is the technological infrastructure that makes complete withdrawal possible. Modern technology has advanced unevenly across the world, yet it's only the societies with the highest quality devices that really feel these problems so much. There are no Hikikomori in starving countries, nor does it seem even in semi-developed countries. The same prosperity that should theoretically create more opportunities has instead enabled a mass retreat from participation itself. So, why is that? I mean, we believe that this can't simply be an accident, just mere coincidence. The combination of 24/7 digital entertainment that can transport users out of their current lives and into another reality, as well as food delivery apps and e-commerce sites that are now ubiquitous in developed economies, create ecosystems where someone can survive indefinitely without so much as looking at another person, let alone meaningful human contact. The pandemic only accelerated that. Some scholars describe this as the atomization of advanced societies. Families become smaller, and within those families, members increasingly live parallel but separate lives. As technology advances, offering ever richer alternative realities through immersive virtual worlds, the question almost writes itself. Just how common will voluntary withdrawal become? Scientific American warned in 2021 that the United States could face a wave of hikikomori as young people accustomed to pandemic isolation simply never fully return to normal life. And while that still seems like a bit of an exaggeration, the concept that things haven't felt as real since 2020 trends widely on social media even today. The crisis that began as isolated cases in Japan has evolved into a global phenomenon affecting millions across the developed world. From Italy's 100,000 withdrawn youths to South Korea's 500,000 isolates to America's 7 million vanished workers, we're now witnessing the emergence of a new social class, those who have opted out entirely, sustained by family support, government benefits, and digital worlds that provide just enough stimulation to prevent total collapse while ensuring that they rarely attempt reintegration. The question is no longer whether the West has its own hikikomori crisis. The data proves that it does. The question now is whether any society has the tools or even the will to address a withdrawal this massive and this entrenched. So, for over a decade, Japan's government largely hoped that the hikikomori problem would sort of solve itself. But when the first generation of hikikomori began to enter their 40s and 50s, when the 80-50 crisis became an undeniable reality, the government could look away no more. Japan has thrown more and more at the situation. The response has evolved from total silence to a national policy, from a ministerial portfolio in 2021 to legislation in 2024 mandating local government action. Over 300 municipalities now run hikikomori-specific projects, a massive mobilization that has to be recognized as a huge step forward. Yet despite all this, the numbers remain stubbornly high. The paradox at the heart of recovery seems almost designed to trap. The very thing needed to heal, human connection, is precisely what the withdrawn person has become psychologically incapable of tolerating. Traditional mental health interventions, which require the patient to come to an office, are next to useless for people who don't leave their rooms. The reality has forced Japan to pioneer unconventional approaches with mixed results. Kyoto launched an online meetup program in the metaverse of all places, allowing withdrawn individuals to interact through avatars as a first step towards human contact. The Ministry of Health therefore created a national Hikikomori voice station, which is an online portal where the withdrawn can seek help without facing anyone. Non-profits like New Start send counselors who visit homes to chat through closed doors, sometimes for months, slowly building trust until the person might crack the door open. What we're learning is that recovery from extreme social withdrawal is more complex than anyone initially believed. The most intensive interventions reveal what recovery actually demands and does leave some ray of hope for the future. At Hito Refresh Camp in Okayama, withdrawn individuals live communally on a farm for months, sharing chores and gradually engaging in group activities. Kadai Yashimura arrived at 26, having spent years in a one-room apartment with only his PlayStation for company. His transformation took 6 months of daily, patient work. First, just leaving his room for meals, then helping in the kitchen. The breakthrough came while watching someone take pride in cooking curry for others. Quote, "I realized that in cooking for others and having a part-time job, you develop a sense of responsibility, something I didn't have before." He now works full-time, catering for the elderly. But stories like Yoshimura's are celebrated precisely because they're exceptional. The recovery process, when it does work, is what experts call delicate and painstaking, which can take months or even years of sustained support. A psychiatrist, Tamaki Saito himself, emphasizes long-term hikikomori almost never resolve their situation through willpower alone. The condition simply requires sustained patient intervention that most families cannot provide themselves. Those isolated for over a decade rarely return to normal social participation. The psychological patterns have become too entrenched, the fear of the outside world just too overwhelming. And while Japan experiments with increasingly creative interventions, the phenomenon spreads globally. The American data proves this alarming trend. During 2020's unprecedented labor shortage, with nearly 12 million open jobs, workforce dropout rates barely budged, despite employers going to ever more desperate lengths for applicants. The withdrawn have become psychologically incapable of responding to economic opportunities. The very thing that might save them has become the thing they fear the most. Different cultures have stumbled upon different pathways. In South Korea, Kim Yong-hee emerged after 10 years through a writing workshop where he could express himself without eye contact or speech. He later published a memoir titled Unexpectedly, I Hikikomori'd for 10 years, describing how creative expression became his bridge back to humanity. The pattern across successful recoveries is consistent. They require finding something that provides purpose without triggering overwhelming social anxiety, then slowly expanding from that foundation. Perhaps most intriguingly, Prime Minister Fumio Kishida has reframed the country's hikikomori not as burdens, but as untapped potential for the nation's struggling economy and plummeting birth rates. Some Japanese companies are now experimenting with home-based jobs designed specifically for hikikomori, recognizing that remote work might offer a pathway back to productivity without the terror of face-to-face interaction. Now, for those of you out there thinking that's a terrible way to look at people, this mere untapped economic potential, well, you might have a point. The government shouldn't have waited until they needed their economic contributions. But there is a deeper point here that is actually very encouraging. The reason this matter goes beyond economics is something fundamental about human nature. Remember the initial steps of becoming hikikomori? They almost always have to do with a sense of purposelessness, feeling both unwanted and unneeded in the world. Recovery stories, on the other hand, what brings people back isn't therapy or medication, and certainly not family pressure. It is purpose, responsibility, and being needed. As automation and artificial intelligence eliminate more jobs, as social interactions move increasingly online, and as traditional sources of meaning and purpose erode, we're creating conditions where withdrawal feels like the only option to more and more people. The tragedy of the hikikomori is that they've surrendered to despair at precisely the moment when fighting for human connection matters most. As today's episode draws to a close, we're left confronting a bit of a paradox that really does define our age. We live in the most connected era in human history, yet millions are choosing complete disconnection. The hikikomori phenomenon forces us to ask what kind of society we've built where withdrawal feels safer than participation, where young people would rather isolate themselves away in darkness than face the light of day. The numbers tell a story of an accelerating crisis. Japan's 1.5 million withdrawn citizens represent a population larger than many cities, yet they've effectively disappeared from public life. South Korea discovered 500,000 young people living in social isolation, while Italy has watched a large number of their own population do the same. America's crisis takes a different form, but tells the same story, with 7 million simply having given up on participating in the workforce entirely. The pandemic helped normalize remote work and remote learning, which certainly has its upsides, but along with that, it also came with its downsides. It removed what had become, for many, the last forcing function that pulled them into society. For countless individuals already on the edge, lockdown became the final push into isolation. What should have been temporary became permanent, as they discovered they could survive without ever leaving their rooms. Now we stand at the edge of something far more revolutionary. Artificial intelligence threatens to remove even more of that from the human experience. While it will indeed help liberate millions from extremely monotonous work that they likely wouldn't have chosen to do, it also will offer precious little opportunity for people to have purpose, a reason to get out of bed in the morning. If you don't trust us, don't take our word for it. AI CEOs are openly projecting mass layoffs, and Meta's Mark Zuckerberg recently painted his vision of the future as one where most people's primary friendships will be with AIs, not humans. Which is weird, Mark. Tamaki Saito warned of adolescence without end, but we're engineering something far more ominous, a society where adolescence never even needs to end, where the uncomfortable growth that comes from facing reality becomes entirely optional, where the messy, difficult, transformative work of building your life through conflict, failure, and interaction could just be avoided. The Hikikomori crisis shows us what happens when people stop believing that they have a place in the world. The tragedy isn't that they've seen the future clearly, it's that they've given up shaping it. The question now is whether we'll learn from their suffering or whether we'll watch as more people follow their paths into isolation. Thank you for watching.